Hi there. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, July 25th. So, I wanted to talk about organizing and outlining today, which is chapter 7, beginning and ending, which is chapter 8, and wording, chapter 9. So, I'm hopeful that by this point in the semester, you would have gotten your textbook and caught up with all of the readings. And as you can see, I've responded to all of you on the discussion forum. As I indicated, you're not required to respond to your peers, though you're certainly encouraged to. Much like if you were in a live classroom, you could raise your hand if you so wanted to. But you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. That would give you a sense of what we would be talking about in class if we were meeting live. And as you know, we are preparing for our first speech number 1, the autobiographical speech, which is a 5-minute speech where you are going to introduce yourself to the class. And in some ways, you did a little bit of this in your discussion forum when you talked a little bit about yourself, but obviously you would expand and develop. And in addition to getting to know your classmates a little bit better, I also wanted you to be able to put into practice some of the elements that we've been talking about in relation to public speaking. So as you know, last class we talked a little bit about Toastmasters, that international organization that is devoted to helping individuals improve their public speaking skills, in no way associated with academia. It's just a community organization so that individuals can not only practice their skills but serve as audience members, which is just as important when you are delivering a speech because you need feedback from your audience. And the Toastmasters organization came out with a video that I had asked you to watch, which gives a good overview of the elements to consider when you are constructing a speech. And then, of course, last class, we also talked about the first few chapters in the textbook. The first chapter talking a little bit about some of the reasons why public speaking is so important. And also talking a little bit about how to get started with putting together a speech, which is where you are now. And then ultimately talking about the difference between listening and hearing, and that as good audience members, we want to do more than just hear, we want to be able to listen. Now, if this were a live class, obviously you would be delivering your speech live and your audience could respond to you. Now, that we don't have necessarily the option of with an online class. Instead, what you would be doing is recording your speech, and much like I record these classes and posting them on our Moodle site, I'm going to be adding a section for speech number 1 when we get a little bit closer to the due date. And then after everybody has uploaded their speeches, one of the assignments is going to be for all of you to view your classmates' speeches and to send me privately a strength and weakness of each of the speeches that you viewed from your classmates. And what I will do is I will compile all of that data and then I will present it to the class, the following class. So this is a way that you can, in some ways, experience the speech, albeit not live, but none of us are experiencing any of this live. And think a little bit about some of the elements in terms of public speaking that not only that you are applying to yourself, but how well your peers are applying them to themselves as well. So today I wanted to talk about organizing and outlining, which is probably one of the most important elements in terms of a speech. So I'm hopeful that at this point you've got a little bit of a sense as to what you might talk about for your autobiographical speech. I deliberately chose the autobiographical speech as the first speech because you don't need to do any outside research. You already have all the information you need for that. That said, there isn't any reason why you couldn't do research if you wanted to talk to family members or do a little bit of genealogical digging. But ultimately, the idea is that you already have all of the information you need now. So it's a question of how you're going to present that. And are you going to try to give us a holistic view of your life? Obviously, you're going to have to condense for 5 minutes. Or would you prefer to focus on a particular time period and talk about why that time period is significant to you? Or perhaps you might want to focus on a particular element in your life, a hobby, an interest, a person, an animal, Again, keep in mind that the focus of the speech is not on the topic that you are discussing, but on how that happens to be important to you. For those individuals who feel a little wary about talking about themselves, I usually suggest that you might want to talk about education, because it's something that we all share, and it's not something that's terribly personal unless you choose to make it personal, whether you talk about your educational past or your educational goals for the future or the reasons why you are enrolled in this particular course. What we will do as we get a little bit closer to the due date for the first speech is that I will have you watching some sample student speeches. These are speeches that were delivered by students like yourselves, in no way affiliated with GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day that you would be a sample student speech. And these are speeches that were uploaded onto YouTube, so I'm assuming that because they are available to the public, that it's appropriate for us to access them and to view them. And I thought that this might be some good practice in terms of our developing the first speech, and also seeing perhaps some techniques you might or might not want to utilize. But before we get to that point where you can see some sample autobiographical speeches, and by the way, I'll do the same thing with the informative speech and also the persuasive speech. And as you know, before you deliver your speeches, I'm going to be asking to meet with each of you briefly, whether it be just a quick email exchange or if you wanted to do something a little bit more formal on the phone or on Zoom, just so that I can get a sense as to how things are going with the construction of the first speech. And again, you can decide how much or how little you want to participate in that. You can actually deliver a speech. That would be one end of the spectrum. Or just basically tell me what your topic is, and that's the other end of the spectrum. Most students choose someplace in between. But the effectiveness of a speech is in part based on the preparation. So you'll remember that the last discussion forum question I had asked you was how to deal with nerves. And there is no necessarily foolproof answer to that. So you know, it's very individual, and my suspicion is that all of you have had to deal with nerve-wracking situations in the past, so you have your own techniques. But some general techniques that tend to work well include being well practiced. The better you know the material, the less likely it is that you are going to be anxious about it. As any teacher, the first time they teach a class is usually the most challenging because they just don't know the material as well. Secondly, that you want to make sure that you've got a good outline. And this is one of the things that we're going to talk about today, the speaking outline, which is different from, let's say, the written outline that you would do, let's say, when you're writing a paper. And the idea behind a speaking outline is that you've got, as the Toastmasters video indicated, keywords and phrases to help jog your memory. And in the event that your memory needed to be jogged, of the topics that you plan to discuss, but that you use unscripted material to discuss those topics. I kind of liken it to perhaps preparing for an important conversation. Let's say in the workplace, if you're going to ask for a raise, chances are that you might have done a little bit of thinking and even rehearsing ahead of time about what you might discuss. Obviously, you wouldn't have a piece of paper in front of you like this, reading to your boss, I believe I need a raise. But chances are also that you've got 3 or 4 or 5 major points that you want to get across. And of course, the employer's response to you will dictate in many respects what avenue you might take. So you might end up choosing a very different route than you might have initially anticipated. But you should have a plan, almost like a road trip where you've got a map or some sort of a guideline as to how to proceed. Another way to deal with nerves, as many of you indicated, is deep breathing. In fact, studies have shown that when individuals are anxious, they tend to breathe very shallowly. Oftentimes, they even hold their breath. I remember taking a women's self-defense class once where we were told if we were ever attacked, what we should do is yell out the word no as loudly as possible. And I had assumed incorrectly, as did most of the class, that we were to do that to draw attention to ourselves. That was secondary. The primary reason was screaming out the word no would require us to take in oxygen into our lungs at a time when we would likely need oxygen and not likely breathe properly to get that oxygen. because we would likely be in a situation of fight or flight. So taking nice deep breaths from the diaphragm. In fact, I've even had students, and I indicated this in one of my responses in the discussion forum, actually list in their speaking outline sections where they wanted to remind themselves to breathe. And obviously, breathing is something that we do naturally. But again, during times of stress, we tend to breathe irregularly or hold our breath, and that's the time that we need oxygen the most. So that's a wonderful way to reduce nerves. Music oftentimes can alleviate anxiety. Particularly, studies have shown classical music. That said, if you don't like classical music, then perhaps that's not the music for you to listen to. Colors, blues and greens in particular, have been shown to reduce anxiety. Making sure that you're just well hydrated, well fed, well slept, or to the best of your ability. And understanding your body, I always suggest that you don't want to try something new immediately before a speech, so that if you have to give a speech in the morning and you're not used to eating breakfast, perhaps that's not the best day to try breakfast, because your body might not necessarily appreciate that change in its routine. You could try that on another day when you don't necessarily have something important to do, like deliver a speech, to see if that's effective or not. I always recommend, too, that you never wear anything new. And the reason why I recommend that is because you just don't know how you're going to feel in that particular piece of clothing because it's new. So the last thing you want to do is be focusing on your wardrobe or your shoes or just comfort. I mean, that said, you don't necessarily have to wear something that's old either. But think about the audience and what's appropriate for the audience. Again, we tend to be a rather casual culture. So I would say that whatever most people would think would be appropriate for wearing, let's say, in a college class, would be appropriate for delivering a speech. Though I have seen some outfits that make me wonder. But nevertheless, you want to be presentable, you want to be respectable, and you want to think a little bit about what your background is, because you are going to be filming, so you don't want it to be too cluttered or distracting. You want to make sure that you've got lighting so that we can see. You want to make sure that you've got good audio so that we can hear. That's been a challenge for me over this last week with this cold that I've been fighting, because it turns out that I think I've developed an ear infection, or so my doctor tells me, because my ear has been clogged up for the last 10 days. It's been quite frustrating, but it seems to be getting better now. I'm quite happy to say. But right now, as I'm speaking, it kind of sounds like I'm underwater, so it's a little bit odd. But of course, as they say, the show must go on. So I continue forward regardless. And as we talk about organizing and outlining, you can see in the notes below, I've highlighted some important points. That when you organize and you outline, that it's easier to remember your points. It's easier to present your points because it's easier to remember. Your points are more credible because you are presenting them in a more authoritative way. And that also means that you tend to be more persuasive. So I had suggested that what you might want to do for your outline is do something similar to what I do with the notes below the video. You'll see that I divide up the sections into major points, and then I've got sub-points underneath them. I find that to work very well. There are different kinds of outlines out there. There are sentence outlines where you're writing out complete sentences. I think those are a little bit too busy myself. That said, the outline is not something that you necessarily share with your audience. The outline is for you. But you want an outline to be effective, because if you've got too much information on your outline and you did need to refer to your outline, well, then you would have to lose eye contact with the audience, or in this instance with the camera, and that you don't want. So you also want to make sure that you've got enough in your outline so that if you were to lose your place, you would be able to find some help to be able to continue forward. So since this isn't the real world, I'm going to ask you to submit in your outline just so that I can give you my feedback. I will be evaluating it informally on a checkmark system. A plus would be excellent. Check plus would be very good. Check would be satisfactory. That's usually where the grades fall. There also is a lesson satisfactory and unsatisfactory. I'm going to ask you to submit in a copy of your outline to me via email, which is Ruiz, Ruiz, @gcc pc.mass.edu when you upload your speech, so that I can watch your speech and also refer to your outline. And I can tell you right now that I'm using my outline. It's right here. I don't know if you can see the text. Of course, it'll be backwards. So this is basically what's just underneath the video. So if I happen to lose my place, I can look very quickly down and then look back up and talk a little bit about the next topic. And since the audience never sees your outline, it's not necessarily something that you have to follow verbatim. Keep in mind that it's just a guideline, but once you go off of that outline, there's a greater possibility of getting lost. Just like once you decide to no longer follow your GPS, there's a greater possibility of getting lost. So you want to be cautious about that. So you might be comfortable, or at least more familiar with, writing outlines for papers. Those outlines are usually much more detailed, because the more detailed, the better to help you write a paper. So in some ways, this is the opposite. And I've had students, remember I teach both English classes and public speaking classes. I've had students who say that they aren't necessarily that comfortable with public speaking, but they are comfortable with writing papers. One of the suggestions I have is to write out the first speech as a paper, and then to reduce it to key words and phrases. That's your speaking outline. And then basically you could tell us what your paper was about. I give the opposite advice to some of my students in my English classes who tell me that they're not comfortable writing a paper, but they are comfortable speaking. And what I suggest is that they record themselves talking out the paper. And then what they do is they transcribe that, and then ultimately that is the draft of their paper. So you can work it any way, as long as that ultimately you've got something in front of you that is an outline that will help you in delivering your first speech. The good news is that many of the techniques that you need to use to write a paper are the techniques you would use with constructing a speech. You need to have a thesis, a central idea, and usually that's delivered at the beginning of the speech or at the beginning of the paper. You need to have an organizational plan. And on the most basic level, that means that you have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Or if you wanted to think about it as an introduction, discussion section, and conclusion, which is how I think the Toastmasters video discussed it, but same sort of idea. And the introduction is important because ultimately not only does it give your thesis, but it also is the first impression that you're going to give your audience. You want to make sure that you greet your audience. Sometimes speakers are so anxious that they forget that they have to greet their audience and they just go straight into the speech. Take a moment to say hello. That helps us gather our thoughts and be prepared to listen, but that also helps you gather your thoughts. It's also a great place to take a nice deep breath. And then, of course, the discussion section is where you have your evidence, and then the conclusion. And the conclusion is important because you want to give a sense of closure. And this is where you want to say goodbye to your audience. You don't want to leave us hanging. It could be as simple as thank you, but that's our cue that it's over. In effect. So how do you organize the points in the discussion section, or how do you organize the points in the body? And there's lots of different ways to do it. Again, if you've written a paper, I suspect you've utilized some or all of these techniques, and you can mix and match, but some are chronological, time order. This works very well when you are teaching somebody something. First this step, then that step, then that step. It could be topical, which is based on categories, which is kind of the way that I organize my outlines underneath our videos, that I've got major categories. Or perhaps it could be order of importance. Two ways to go about doing this. Putting the most important first so that you leave a really strong impression. Or put the most important last so that you leave a lasting impression. And there are cons to both of them. If you put your strongest argument first, the rest of the speech might be a letdown if you aren't able to keep up with arguments that are as convincing. So you might perhaps want to end the speech with your strongest argument and build up to it, but you have to hope that your audience will hang in there with you while you begin with perhaps your weaker arguments. Spatial, or in other words, talking about things in terms of location. This is very useful if you're trying to describe an area. And you can also do causal relationships, how one thing causes another. I oftentimes use the example of a real estate agent trying to sell a piece of property, and that there are lots of different ways this real estate agent can go about selling that piece of property. Part of it is going to depend on the property itself, or in other words, the topic that you would be discussing in your speech. Part of it will be dependent on who is viewing that property, or in other words, your audience who is listening to your speech. Part of that will be dependent on you, the real estate agent, and where your strengths are in terms of presenting information. And the other way of thinking about that is that part of that will be based on your preferences in delivering a speech and what feels more comfortable to you. But if we were talking about that piece of property, we could talk about it in chronological order, especially if it were very old. Perhaps it's on the National Historical Registry, so you could talk about how it was constructed in the late 1700s and talk about all of the owners that have owned that piece of property since then. Or if it's very new construction, that can also be very interesting and appealing to a buyer of a piece of real estate. If your real estate isn't new or old, let's say 40 years or so, perhaps chronological isn't necessarily the best way to go about discussing that piece of property. Perhaps you want to talk about it in terms of topics. So there's several elements that you wanted to mention about this property. You wanted to talk about its neighborhood. You wanted to talk about the new roof that was installed. You wanted to talk about its proximity to public transportation. And you might even want to put these topics in order of importance. And that can be subjective. That what's important for one person may not necessarily be important for another. So for one person, the new roof might be important. For another person, the proximity to public transportation might be the most important. So you would adapt based on who's viewing that property. And again, you have to decide, if you can decide as to what's most or least important, do you put the most important first and hope your audience hangs in there with you? Or do you put the most important last and also hope that the audience is patient while you build up to that? Spatially, you could talk about that property, that once you walk in, to the left is a living room, and you go up a staircase, and immediately in front of you is a kitchen, and on the right-hand side is a small bedroom that could be used as a den. On the left-hand side is a dining room that leads out to a deck. Now, you've never been in this property, but I'm describing what it looks like. So lots of different ways that you can organize. There is no right or wrong way to organize outside of the intro, the body, and the conclusion. So it'll depend again on what your topic is and what your preference is and who your audience is. So some suggestions for you when you are putting together all of this information. What tends to appeal to audiences are things that are familiar. You can see how oftentimes this is the case when someone is, let's say, reading the news or watching the news. I know that I tend to pay a lot more attention when it is something that is connected to me, let's say something like education. If it's about higher education, I'll pay more attention. If it's about Greenfield Community College, I'll read it in its entirety. Question and answers. This is an effective way for putting together a speech. Now, if you are going to be putting forth questions, you want to be able to supply answers, unless it's a rhetorical question, that it's a question that doesn't require an answer. But you never know how those things go. I remember very clearly one of the early Shakespeare classes I taught where I asked a rhetorical question. It happened to be about a drama that you might be familiar with, Midsummer Night's Dream. And it happens to be a Shakespearean comedy where, through the use of magic, many couples fall in and out of love. And it turns out that because of magic, one of the most beautiful characters and one of the most highest ranking characters in the play, Titania, she's the queen of the fairy, falls in love with not just a human, but one of the lowest orders humans in the play. His name is Bottom, because he's a laborer, he's at the bottom of the social scale, but he also acts like, well, a bottom, an ass. And to make things even more interesting, by this point in the play, when she falls in love with him, not only is she under a magic spell, but so is Bottom. He's under a magic spell. So he's been literally turned into a bottom, an ass, a donkey, because he's been acting that way, like an ass. And despite the fact that everyone is being manipulated by magic, I know sometimes readers and certainly my students wonder, how can someone as sophisticated and as classy as the Queen of the Fairies fall in love with Bottom? And my rhetorical question to try to show that Shakespeare is about timeless and universal concerns is, well, how many of us have ever fallen in love with an ass? And what I was expecting were a few chuckles, but I actually got hands in the air with people who wanted to share their stories, which was fine. Actually, it was great because it showed how people could really engage with the material and make it applicable to their own lives, because we probably all have our stories about how we've fallen in love with an ass, which was one of the points that Shakespeare was making in that play. But I used this example to sort of illustrate that I had asked a rhetorical question. I didn't necessarily expect an answer, but I got an answer. You never know. Now, of course, you aren't going to be interacting with a live audience. So that said, you kind of have to think ahead if you're going to ask a question, whether or not it's something that could be answered by the average person, or are you going to have to supply an answer? Problem and solution is a great way of putting together a speech, especially something like a persuasive speech, where you have to show that there's some sort of issue or problem to try to convince us to take an action or to support a position. Or process of elimination, you just eliminate all of the options until you're left with one. So going back to your speaking outline, it should be keywords and phrases. Oftentimes it's useful to list stage directions, so if you plan on doing something, I suggested that sometimes students will list things like breathe. But if you wanted to show your audience a prop, let's say, and you don't have to use an audio visual for this first speech. That's something that we will be doing for the second speech. But I wanted to certainly allow you to use an audio visual if you so wanted to. But I wanted you to focus on the first speech just in delivering your speech, not having to worry about manipulating audio visuals, because we'll talk about that further on. I always say that you want to have some sort of paper outline. You don't want to rely on something that's electronic on a screen for a couple of reasons. First of all, if there's a mechanical failure, then you've lost your outline. So now you're lost completely. And secondly, oftentimes when you are recording, it's quite obvious that you are reading off of a screen, and you don't want to be reading off of a screen. Oftentimes you will have things like reflections and shadows that will show the screen itself. And again, keep in mind that your paper outline should be keywords and phrases, not complete sentences and paragraphs throughout its entirety, because you want to be able to skim it rather easily. The textbook gives you several examples of outlines that, in my opinion, are much too detailed. They're very useful for you as a reader, because if you were to read these outlines, you would see that basically it's a summary of what the speech is. You could read those outlines out loud and have the speech itself. But again, I don't think those outlines would be terribly useful for you. So for instance, if you're using the edition of the book that I had ordered, on page 119, there's an outline on drunk driving that I believe is much too detailed to really be useful to you if you're delivering a speech. Though it's useful to you if you're reading a textbook and you wanted to get a sense of how a speech about drunk driving could be given. So, I wanted to also talk about memory. And if we have poor listening skills, we also have poor memory skills. How poor? Poor. Some studies have shown that we can remember plus to minus anywhere between 7 to 3 items. Well, think about what's less than 3, 2 or 1. That's pretty small. Now, obviously, we can all remember more than 3 items or even more than 7 items. And again, it's not an exact number, it's plus or minus. But the point is that it's a small number, and some of the techniques that we use that you can use in presenting information to your audience so that they can remember information, as well as you can use personally to help present information. Chunking, grouping like items together. It's something that we tend to do with phone numbers. You know that phone numbers are divided into 3 digits and then 4 digits afterwards, so that we don't have to remember each separate digit. We can remember 2 groups. So for instance, the phone number for GCC, 775-1000. Now I could say 1000, that's 4 things to remember. Or I could say 1000, that's 1 thing to remember. So I've chunked that information together. Mnemonics, which means memory techniques or devices. Chances are you've been utilizing this throughout your academic career. Ways to remember things. Repetition. The more you repeat something, the more likely you are to remember it. Advertisers know this quite well, which is why they tend to repeat themselves. Acronyms. When you are using the first letter of each word to form some sort of a phrase or even just a word to help you remember a more complex topic. Oftentimes these are used in the sciences and used in math, sometimes in music as well. Though you can use them in English classes, one acronym that I talk about with my students is KISS, which stands for Keep It Simple, Silly. You might have heard it as Keep It Simple, Stupid, but that seems a little bit harsh. The idea that you want to be as concise, direct, and simple as possible in your writing. And again, these are techniques that you can utilize to not only help you remember information to present to the audience, but you can provide us with an acronym. And chances are that you are, when you're delivering a speech, giving more repetition than you certainly would if you were writing, because when you're writing, we as readers can reread what you wrote. But the problem is with listening is that once it's said, it's gone. So oftentimes you do need to repeat yourself more than you would if you were writing something. So beginning and ending speeches. And the entire speech is important. Certainly the bulk of the speech, the discussion section or the body is the most important. But there is a phenomenon called the primary recency effect, which I have mentioned in the notes below in the second section. Point 1, that we best remember, according to studies, what we first hear and see and what we last hear and see. This is very important because it's all about first and last impressions. So we tend to remember our first impression and our last impression. And in terms of memory, what that means is that you're more likely to remember an introduction and a conclusion than you are a body. If you wanted to try to test this theory, you might want to think about something like an important event in your life, perhaps a holiday. Chances are that you remember the beginning and the ending of it more clearly than you remember the middle of it. What this means for you is that you want to put a little bit of extra effort into your introduction and conclusion, the beginning and the ending, even though that usually is not the longest part of the speech. The longest part of the speech is the discussion section. So, some techniques you could utilize for either an introduction or a conclusion. My suspicion is that you've utilized some of these techniques in the past in writing. Talking about reality, things that are real, that tends to get an audience's attention. Talking about things that are nearby, proximity, that will get an audience's attention. Talking about things that are familiar, as I was saying earlier, that will get an audience's attention. Things that are suspenseful will also get an audience's attention. It's one of the techniques that news media utilizes, unfortunately, in addition to using conflict. That's something else that tends to get an audience's attention. Humor. Though you've got to be careful with humor because humor can be very individual and very culturally based. In fact, over the next couple of classes, we'll talk about culture, which in its broadest form is any group membership. And it comes with certain behaviors and values and beliefs. And what could be humorous in one group or culture may not be humorous in another. Just merely stating that something is important in your beginning and or your ending already raises it to a certain level of importance. Question answer, as I was indicating, that if you ask a question, I think it's very human for an audience to provide an answer, even if they aren't necessarily articulating that answer out loud. Much like the example I gave about A Midsummer Night's Dream and Bottom and marrying an ass or having a relationship with an ass. Ooh, sorry about that. Quotation can be very useful. Obviously, the quote has to be related to the actual topic of your speech. And beginning or ending with a quote can be very useful. I know everybody nowadays, they just go online, they go on Google, and they go for the first thing they see. I suggest that's not necessarily the best way to search. There is a reference called Bartlett's Familiar Quotations, which you can find online, that is structured much like a dictionary, based on topics in alphabetical order, so that you could find a quotation, let's say, about love. You would go to the L section, and then there would be multiple quotations about love, and then you could choose one that would be appropriate for your particular paper, speech, presentation, whatever the case may happen to be. That's it. Certainly, you can go online and look for quotations as well, but as you know, there always is risk involved. I see many quotes online that are attributed to particular authors that are incorrect, so you want to make sure that you verify. Storytelling. People love stories. It's one of the first things we do when we're kids. We ask for stories. So beginning or ending a speech with a story, of course, it has to be connected to the topic that you're discussing. Can be very engaging. A personal reference to yourself, because people are usually interested somewhat in the speaker. Again, it has to be related in one way or another to the topic. A startling statement, surprising your audience. And I think I gave you an example last class of how someone did this poorly at another institution where they were giving a philosophical speech about being true to themselves, and they began to disrobe so that they could show their true selves. And yes, they were trying to shock the audience, but might I suggest that they weren't thinking about the purpose of their speech and the expectations of the audience. I can give you an example of a startling statement, however, that did work very well, and this was in one of my own classes. And it happened in a in-person class, a long class, a 3-hour class. And we were on break, so it was about midway through the class. And people were just coming back from break. Most of them had gotten snacks. I was ruffling through my notes. No one was really paying attention. And it was a day in which speeches were to be presented. And then all of a sudden, I begin hearing somebody choking at the back of the classroom. And I look up, and you know the old cliche about time standing still? That's exactly what it felt like. As I'm seeing this person choking, and a million thoughts are going through my mind. They're all the way in the back. I'm all the way in the front. Am I going to make it to them in time so that I can assist? Do I call 911? Do I call security? Do I remember the Heimlich maneuver? I didn't have much time at all. I had just basically had enough time to stand up, not even to move from my desk at the front of the room, where a classmate had approached the choking victim, performed the Heimlich maneuver. And what popped out of the choking victim's mouth was a rolled ball of paper. It was quite surreal. All of us are staring at this rolled ball of paper. And the person who performed the Heimlich maneuver very casually walks to the front of the classroom and announces that what we had just witnessed was a simulation of a choking. But if it was a real choking, would we have known what to do? And their speech topic for their informative speech was about the Heimlich maneuver. And let me tell you, all of us were quite impressed and quite interested, because now all of a sudden this speech had great relevance because we were all in the same place thinking, what do we do? How do we do it? Someone might die. So again, all of this had been planned ahead of time. The speaker was friends with the person who pretended, quote unquote, to choke. They had put a piece of paper in their mouth that they spit out. Things could have gone wrong. You know, if someone else had approached that choking victim first, they might have actually performed the Heimlich maneuver rather than pretend to perform it. You can actually break ribs performing the Heimlich maneuver. Or the person who was pretending to choke on the paper might have actually started choking, and then, of course, they aren't receiving the Heimlich maneuver from their friend because their friend thinks that it's fake. So things could have gone wrong, so you need to plan carefully. But I'll never forget that speech, and I've listened to probably hundreds of speeches, maybe thousands at this point over the course of my career, but that speech really stood out. Or forecasting and summarizing. Again, this is an old writing technique. Tell the audience what you're going to talk about or write about, then talk about it or write about it, and then remind the audience what you talked about or wrote about. So all of these work really well for introductions and conclusions. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was chapter 9, which is wording your speech. Now, that's where writing and public speaking have some differences. And that ultimately when you're writing, you want to be as precise as possible with your language, because you can literally spend months trying to find the perfect word. That is not the case when you're speaking, especially when you are speaking in the moment. So that you want to have an oral style. That's different from the written style. The oral style is conversational. It's as if you are talking to somebody. You're using simpler vocabulary, you're using shorter sentences, and you're much less formal. And keep in mind, again, that's one of the reasons why you don't want to memorize a speech or read your speech, because you're not going to have that sense of conversationality. So, that said, there are ways, and if you think about some of the great speakers of our time, oftentimes people will talk about the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King. Oftentimes that's ranked by people who study rhetoric as perhaps the best speech or one of the most effective speeches ever given. That they're utilizing more than just the ability to be conversational, to communicate information. There are advanced techniques. Again, we're not necessarily at that place, but if you wanted to play around with things, definitions, for instance. Usually we talk about the denotation of a word, and this is in the second section of Wording Your Speech, Part 3. That's the dictionary definition. The way I remember that is with the repetition of D. Denotation, dictionary, definition, DDD. But there also is the connotation of a word, the associations of a word. Two words can have a very similar dictionary definition, but two very different connotations or associations. So think about two words with a very similar dictionary definition. Cheap and frugal. You don't spend a lot of money. The connotations or the associations of those words are very different. Cheap implies something negative, somebody who's stingy, as opposed to frugal, it implies something positive, somebody who's intelligent. And again, the denotation and the connotation is something that oftentimes is utilized by advertisers. Advertisers are very cautious when it comes to language because they want to make sure that they can sway you. So they oftentimes will talk about mature audiences rather than elderly, let's say. Just think about some of the ways that we use euphemisms. The way that we go through not necessarily stating something that is too blunt. And when we talk about the restroom, we're probably not resting in there. When we talk about the powder room, we're probably not powdering in there. And that said, when we're talking about the bathroom, we're probably not bathing in there. But oftentimes these are euphemisms that are considered to be acceptable in our language rather than saying the blunt thing that it is. You know, somebody who perhaps is big boned rather than fat, for instance. Yeah, so think about the language that you're using, but again, don't get too tongue-struck with it or tongue-tied with it, because ultimately you want to be conversational. You don't have to be as precise as you would be with your writing. And there are also negative definitions, a definition of what something is not. Usually we define what something is. For instance, rich means having a certain amount of affluence or money. And a negative definition would be defining what rich is it. By rich, I do not mean affluence or money. I mean happiness and health. So that gives a whole different context to a definition, something you wouldn't find in Webster's dictionary. Or a contextual definition, a definition that's influenced by the context, the situation, how it's used. So if I were talking about brief in, let's say, a classroom, a writing classroom or a public speaking classroom, I'm probably talking about being concise. However, if I were teaching a class in law school, I probably mean a legal report, a brief. And if I were teaching a fashion class, I might be talking about an article of clothing, a brief. So it depends on the context in which it's used. So some of the advanced techniques that some of the great speeches of our time have utilized, imagery. They oftentimes are quite poetic, where they utilize the senses that assist you with visualization. And again, advertisers will oftentimes do this. So if you've ever seen an advertisement for, let's say, a beverage, before you saw the advertisement, you weren't thirsty, but afterwards you were, it's probably because they were using all kinds of sensory images. They were probably providing you with language that would make you thirsty, images that would make you thirsty. Metaphor. That's also a very poetic element that you use in literature, where you are comparing two dissimilar things without using like or as. If you do use like or as, that's considered not to be a metaphor. Think about something like saying someone is cold as ice. So that would not be a metaphor. But that said, that would be a simile. A metaphor would be comparing two dissimilar things without like or as. I remember listening to a practice speech once that said that the speaker was red. It was an autobiographical speech. I am red. Not that I am like red, but I am red. It was actually quite clever. They were talking about all of the attributes associated with the color red that would be applicable to their personality. But sometimes these things can get out of control, or what I call tap dancing, where a writer or a speaker is trying a little bit too hard to make connections. So once this person went beyond some of the obvious associations with red, passion and fire and anger, they started talking about the different colors on a car terminal battery. It became a little bit difficult to follow. So you want to be careful if you're using a metaphor or even a simile to make sure that it's clear to your audience. Again, especially if you are speaking, because if you're writing, at least you could go back and reread it, but you don't have that luxury when you're listening to a speech. Rhyme, words that have similar endings, so that oftentimes we see that in poems and also in songs. And songs and poetry share lots of similarities, as I talk about in my literature class. So the endings of the words have similar sounds. Or alliteration. This is where the beginnings of the words have similar sounds. So you can utilize these techniques, these more advanced techniques, to make your speech more compelling and to make it more interesting. But again, these are advanced techniques. We're at the place now where we are trying to remember to breathe when we are giving our speech, and to have an introduction and a body and a conclusion. So I just state this for you to keep in the back of your mind. In terms of language, always try to be audience-centered, which means to be appropriate for your audience. That doesn't mean standing in the center of your audience, but thinking about the needs and the expectations of your audience. You want to try to be as neutral as possible, and you want to try to be as culturally sensitive and inclusive as possible. But you certainly don't want to become so anxious that you're afraid to say anything at all, which I've seen happen in our society. And I think that all of us make errors in our speaking that we wouldn't necessarily make in our writing. I know I do. I'm perfectly aware that I should be talking about the postal carrier. But every day I ask, has the mailman come? Which is particularly problematic because the mailman is a woman. That said, I know that mailman is gender specific and I should try to be gender neutral. I would never do that in writing, but again, it might pop out. Pronouns have become particularly controversial lately as to whether or not there is such a thing as a binary for he and she, and could they substitute for he or she, and if you are going to use he or she, does he go before she, does she go before he, and if you're going to use just one pronoun, you want to make sure that it's not necessarily gender exclusive. For instance, a doctor should examine his patients. That would imply that doctors are male. Better to put it in the plural. Doctors should examine their patients. And again, what I say is just to try to be sensitive, try to be inclusive, try to be appropriate. I'm almost certain that if I were ever in a situation that was dangerous, I would yell out for a policeman or a fireman. But I know better that I should be asking for a police officer or a firefighter, and certainly I would write that out. But in times of stress, I don't know if I would say that, per se. So what's left is our attendance question for today, and that'll be due on Thursday, the 27th by 9 a.m. By this point, I expect you've gotten the text and you're all caught up, so you should have this done by Thursday at 9 a.m. If it turns out that you can't have it done by then, please ask for an extension, and I will grant you an extension. And it's about speech number 1, which I'm hopeful that you're thinking about at this point. What do you think is going to be your biggest challenge delivering speech number 1, and why? What do you think your biggest challenge will be delivering speech number 1, and why? And you've probably figured out by this point that I'm deliberately asking questions that don't have right or wrong answers. I'm more interested in your thinking than I am in the answer itself. Again, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. So I hope you're doing well, and I'm on the mends, I believe. And next class, we will continue on talking about the next 3 chapters in the textbook. Take care. Bye-bye.